Hi, my name is Ed Friedman. I'm the chairman of Friends of Merrymeeting Bay, and I'm going to provide a little introduction to our speaker series presentation from last night, January 2017 here. Tom Desjardin's talk, Life and Times of Ruben Colburn, Bateaux to Quebec. So, Friends of Merrymeeting Bay, first of all, very unique, holistic organization. We do research, we do advocacy work, we do land conservation, and we have a very active education program, all focused on the Gulf of Maine and Merrymeeting Bay. And so we work at the local, the state, and the federal levels, and are unique in this regard. One of the pieces of our education program is this speaker series, and believe it or not, this is our 20th year. The series is always outstanding, and this year is no exception. We've had a long-time partner in the series. That's Patagonia, the local Patagonia folks down in Freeport. They've co-sponsored us, and they typically provide a piece of clothing that we can we can raffle off for a small contribution to our basket that gets passed around. And this helps us defray the costs, which are about $1,000, to put the series on every year. So with that, let me provide a little introduction here to, again, Tom Desjardin and the talk tonight. Many people have heard of Benedict Arnold and his march to Quebec in 1775 up the Kennebec and Dead River to hopefully capture Quebec City. Few know much about his boat builder, Ruben Colburn, from Pittston, just upstream of us right now. Ruben was a lumberman and a shipbuilder in town there. His home, the Major Ruben Colburn house, is listed on the National Register of Historic Places. And Colburn made great contributions to the American side in the Revolutionary War, including bringing on the local Abenaki tribes to the side of, to George Washington and to our side in the war. They became our allies against the British. When informed of a plan to capture Quebec City under the command of Colonel Benedict Arnold at that point, Colburn offered his services to the Continental Army, complete with scouts, maps, and boats. And Arnold was so enthusiastic about the new support, he wrote Colburn immediately, "Sir, His Excellency General Washington desires you will inform yourself how soon there can be procured or built at Kennebec 200 light bateaux capable of carrying 6 or 7 men each, with their provisions and baggage, say 100 weight to each man. The boats to be furnished with 4 oars, 2 paddles, and 2 setting poles each, the expense of building them, and whether a sufficient quantity of nails can be procured with you." Colburn agreed, and in a matter of a couple of weeks built a whole lot of boats for the general. Our speaker tonight, Tom Desjardin, holds a PhD in U.S. history and has written several books on the Civil War with emphasis on Gettysburg. During the 1990s, he served as the archivist and historian at Gettysburg Military National Park, or Gettysburg National Military Park. He later taught Civil War history at Bowdoin College in Maine, where Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, and Gettysburg hero Joshua Chamberlain was a student, professor, and president. Experienced in both television and film, Desjardin served as a historical advisor to actor Jeff Daniels. My camera's falling down. Excuse me. Shoot. So hopefully I'm still on. Desjardin served as historical advisor to actor Jeff Daniels for his role in Chamberlain in the films Gettysburg and Gods and Generals. He and his work have been featured on the History Channel, A&E, Discovery, PBS, and C-SPAN. Tom currently serves as the director of the Maine Bureau of Parks and Lands. And we welcome Tom, and thank you very much.
So essentially, Arnold, who had been involved in trading, T-R-A-D-I-N-G, before merchant trading, before the war, understood, as people had all the way back to Champlain, that there was this vaguely identifiable passage up the Kennebec River, over the height of land at Corbangor, and then down the Chaudière River to Quebec. And so it was kind of there, and the natives had used it for thousands of years, but no one had a good handle on how far, distances, how wide, and so on. But about this time, Arnold had come back from taking Fort Ticonderoga and came back to Washington without anything to do. Now, still before 1776, so there's no Declaration of Independence yet. There's this ragtag army of different people. So he says to Arnold, he says, I got to do something with these guys in camp. The British are staying put, and so we got to winter and figure out how to keep ourselves occupied. Arnold says, you know, I've heard of this passage up to Quebec, and we could probably take an army and snatch that from the British because they're probably not even paying attention to it right now. So Washington sent an army up to Montreal, up Lake Champlain and up in that direction, and then decided to pull together an army of about 1,000 men or so for Arnold to go up the Kennebec. And it would pose a problem for the British in that you abandon Montreal and fall back to Quebec, in which case, yay, we took Montreal. Or they abandoned Quebec to reinforce Montreal, in which case, yay, we took Quebec. Or they split their forces between the two, try to save both cities, and maybe we take both and take all of Canada. As much as the English Protestant folks didn't like those pesky Catholic Frenchmen living in Quebec province, which, by the way, included parts of Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. I mean, Quebec province at the time was massive. But they didn't like those French people, unless, of course, they helped us get the British out. Then maybe we'd... So there was discussion about a 14th colony and trying to get the British, that being the French and the French Canadians in Quebec province, to come in on the colonial side, help take Quebec and boost the army. And Arnold had visions of thousands of Indians and Quebecois coming in, and which never materialized. But so Arnold goes into camp in Washington, and they say, well, we're going to, this always makes me laugh, we're going to go to this place called the province of Maine. It's part of Massachusetts. You've never been there. But we're going to sail up the coast, and then we're going to sail up the river a little ways. Then we're going to get these really big boats, and we're going to paddle them against the river all the way to this height of land, climb over this mountain, put it in another river, ride down to Quebec, and we're not going to start until the beginning of winter in Maine. Who wants to go? About 1,000 hands said, oh, I'll do that. And a good portion of them were Virginians, were riflemen from Virginia. So I'm not staying in Boston the rest of the time. I don't even like the Red Sox, so I don't, you know. So amazingly, all of these soldiers say, yeah, I'll do that, on foot, or on, you know, most of it on foot. The boats were mostly to carry stuff, not so much to carry people, necessarily. And so they sailed from Newburyport, Massachusetts, to Pittston, or what then was called Gardnerstown, and to a little place called Colburn Town within Gardnerstown. And there they met Ruben Colburn, who a couple of times had been down to visit Washington, George Washington, and said, I know the land, I know the rivers, I know the Indians. You know, what can we do to help? We got all these people up in Maine who want to fight. We got all these natives we could bring in. What can we do? And Washington said, well, we're not going to use the natives because they didn't behave gentlemanly in warfare. And they did things like tortured and you know, they didn't line up in red coats on the middle of a field and stand there and wait for the enemy to come, and then everyone loads their weapons and fires. They hid in the woods and shot back and things like that. So they decided that the natives' tactics were just not sporting for wartime. But they said, one of those visits, Washington said, wait, where are you from? He says, well, I'm up on the Kennebec River. And, wait, Arnold, Benedict, come in here. And so they devised this method. This guy knows the river, he knows the place, he's a boat builder, he's got lumber, he's got a mill. Maybe we can make this work. So they devised this plan, and they gave Ruben 3 weeks, 21 days, to build 200 bateaux, plus the setting poles, 4 setting poles, 2 setting poles, 4 oars, all the metal that goes with it, the metal tips on the setting poles and so on, oar locks, everything else, and have them ready. And of course, I'm sure Washington said, we need all these things. Okay, I'll do that. And we need them in 2 weeks. So he came on, now Sunday you don't work, because it's the Sabbath. And so Ruben and everyone else in Gardnerstown, Pittston, started building these boats. And darned if when Arnold landed his ships on the 21st of September, there weren't 200 boats upside down laying on the shore waiting for him. He'd get off and said, oh, they're too small, I need 20 more. 3 days later, there were 20 more boats upside down. The 2 biggest problems were the bateau, they were called. And the Indians called it the white man's canoe. The Bateaux were big because they had to carry barrels of powder, dough, lead, food. They carried all the supplies to get the army. Most of the men would walk on the shore. A couple of men poling, a couple of men rowing, and then at portages when they had to pass over rapids or falls or anything, the guys would come out of the woods to the edge and they'd carry all the stuff. So this fellow built it. Now, all we know about Ruben physically is that he was a short, irascible, balding man. But he was known as Major Ruben Colburn. He was Major of the Massachusetts Militia. He was eventually representative to the Massachusetts Assembly and argued vehemently, as did a lot of people up here, for the separation of Maine from Massachusetts in 1790 because it was too darn far to go to court. They had to go all the way down to Boston, and they were losing court cases, the men land cases and things like that, because they couldn't go down to Boston. And so if they severed off from Massachusetts, we could build a capital and have a court and all of that kind of stuff. So he was a little ahead of his time. He was 30 years ahead, but he was in the Committee of Safety, a local tax collector. One of my favorites, well, I'll get to the other stories about Ruben in a minute. Ruben was, I don't know if say friendly, they probably never had a beer together, but he was in contact with and knew George Washington, which is kind of neat, father of our country. We don't believe that and have any evidence that George ever spent the night at the Colburn house, because then we'd hang the sign George Washington slept here on the front. But these are the records from George Washington's records in the National Archives in his record books. And it shows, for example, his ledger for 1775, and it says Ruben Colburn, 10 pounds. And this is for, he gave him money for planks for the boats, corn to feed the men building the boats, and things of that nature. So he gave him some money and said, go back and build me the boats. And in Washington's records, you've seen many mentions of Ruben. Then he gave him this document, which I once held in my hand, which is really neat. It's at the National Archives, signed by George Washington. And these are the instructions for Ruben Colburn. When he said, all right, we're going to do this. We're going to send the army up. They'll be there on the 21st or so. And here's what, oops, if I can go the right way here. There we go. Here's what he said to him. There wasn't Microsoft Word back then. It was sometimes almost illegible to read. Headquarters at Cambridge, September 3rd, 1775. You are to go with all expedition to Gardnerstown upon the river Kennebec, and without delay proceed to the constructing of 200 bateaux, to row with 4 oars each, 2 paddles, and 2 setting poles, to be also provided for each bateau. And that was probably harder than the dang boats, because each of the, and we have a number of these on display, they had the metal tip on the end and the little ring that you drove down to hold the metal tip in place. And just the ring takes quite a bit of time, and you do that times 200 boats and 2 per. So you're talking 400 of, even with my bad math skills, 400 of those little rings and 400 of those points, and plus spares and so on. And but that was, so they needed, how many blacksmiths? The other thing about the boats was putting them together was difficult because you couldn't go to Home Depot and buy nails. So a blacksmith had to make every nail one at a time by hand. And every blacksmith making nails wasn't making points or rings for the setting poles. So this took a massive amount of effort with a very small number of people. And it ended up with too few nails, which is a part of our story a little bit. You are to engage a company of 20 men, consisting of artificers, carpenters, and guides, to go under your command to assist in such services as you and they may be called upon to execute. You're to purchase 500 bushels of Indian corn. That's a lot. 500 bushels of Indian corn. To provide the workmen employed in building the bateaux. If you come build the boats with me, everybody in Gardnerstown, I will give you corn. Okay. You are to bespeak all, means go get, all of the pork and flour you can from the inhabitants upon the river Kennebec, and a commissary will be immediately sent from the commissary general to agree and pay for the same. You will also acquaint the inhabitants that the commissary will have orders to purchase 60 barrels of salted beef, 220 pounds each barrel. You start to see what the bateaux were for when you 220-pound barrels, and there's 60 of them. You are to receive 40 shillings lawful money for each bateau. You never received it. With the oars, paddles, and setting poles included, out of which you are also to pay the artificers and for all the provisions, nails, etc. Now, Ruben built them, did all that Washington asked. He paid the local people anticipating a refund and never got it. Now, as the family history goes, which is Tom's way of saying this probably isn't true, George Colburn a number of times petitioned the Continental Congress and then the American Congress for a return of the pay that he never received for these boats. And he has the records. They're in Washington's records. And the Congress kind of hemmed and hawed and said, geez, if we pay him, how many people we got to pay for every time somebody helped the revolutionary people? And so they invented, basically, at the time, a statute of limitations and said, look, the war's been over too long. You're all out of luck. Including Colburn, who had one of the biggest claims because of this expedition. So the story, family legend or story, is that somebody finally said to him, you know what? I bet if you go down to Mount Vernon and find George Washington and have him write a letter to Congress saying, look, I owe this guy the money, you owe him the money, pay him. How could they not pay you? He's the father of our country and so on. You know, that's a good idea. So as the family legend has it, he got in a boat and went all the way down to the bay and then up the Potomac and got to Mount Vernon, knocked at the gate, and they said, geez, I'm sorry, he died last night. Well, it turns out George Washington had been pretty much comatose and useless for about a week, so it really wasn't quite as close as that. But if, in fact, he did, it makes for a good story. And oftentimes, if it makes for a good story, it's probably not really true. Just ask the media about Russians and whatever else is going on. Those stories never go away. So he also was in business with John Hancock. Many of you might know that down in York County there's a warehouse that was at the old York Historical Society folks down there. That was a lumber warehouse and other things that John Hancock had built to move goods and stuff around. So he once wrote to Colburn, and they were obviously, from the familiarity in the letter, this isn't the first time they've written to each other and know each other. But he bought lumber from Ruben. Ruben had a mill across from the house on the pond in Pittston, and oxen and so on, and so he would, sawed lumber as one of his enterprises. So Hancock, who was governor of Massachusetts at the time in 1787, this is what Ruben wrote to him. And this is in phonetically spelled out the way Ruben spelled it. So, there weren't colleges and universities all up and down the Kennebec in those days. So, dear sir, I have shipped 14, let me see if I can read this without stumbling. Shipped 14 sticks of pine lumber, usually masts or parts of the masting of ships. Agreeable, there we go. Agreeable to your directions on board of William Porter, marked J.H. Means it's on that ship and you branded, either stamped or branded the initials of the person to receive it. Sir, I have not collected one bit of lumber of Colonel North, who at the time was at Fort Western. He has been in Boston some time. Actually, Colonel North was the one who had to, I think, stood trial for mistreating a young woman in a bad way. But anyway, he has been in Martha Ballard's diary. It's funny how all the different main stories end up weaving together. Let's see. As soon as he returns, I shall do my endeavor to collect the other lumber. I don't know why collect is capitalized in lumber, but anyway, and send it to you. I had agreed with Adam Gardner for your lumber, but his sodding, meaning sudden death, or the old British sod, it's sodding, death disappoint me. Well, probably disappointed him too a little bit, but anyway. I am very sorry that it has not been in my power to send you your lumber. Mr. Harry Quince has got him a clever lodge house, meaning log house, and moved in with a smart family. Well, good, because they can maybe translate this letter for him. And it's got to work on the lot, and I hope with assistance in some directions. So what he's basically saying is, people in common, we have a wood lot, you know these people, they're working, things are coming along. So they were very well acquainted and did business together, which is an interesting thing. We also know that, I think it was his nephew, that he sent to work for, and maybe live with Colburn for a time, but we're not as vague, the record's not so good as to all of that. But so Ruben, he had actually had, when Arnold men passed in Waterville, the Big Falls, he had a mill there too. They mentioned it's all run down and falling apart. But then again, on the other hand, maybe if you lived in Boston or some other place, you would see a nice, beautiful mill in the town. But when you're just up there to cut lumber as long as you can, you don't need a fancy mill. So his mill may have looked run down, but it just needed a blade that went up and down and cut lumber. So rather than bring it down and cut it, Ruben had a mill up on the falls in Skowhegan. So just a quick aside, in 2009 to 10 and 11 and eventually went to 13, we did a massive amount of work on the Colburn House, and we ended up doing about $250,000 worth of work. A lot of it either donated or volunteer work. The local house jacking company came one day unannounced. I was there working on something, and they pulled up in the driveway and started jacking the carriage house up. Didn't even ask, didn't say anything, just did. And they lived right up the street, and their ancestors are sort of related to Jewett as well, and so they just, we'll do it. Then they came and did the barn. We paid them for that. But they jacked up the barn, which had sunk into the ground. We buried the utilities. We took away the basketball backboard, anything that wasn't historic, and tried to make, as best we could, the place look like it does. It really is a representation of the house. Ruben's grandson, Gustavus Adolphus Colburn, inherited the property and totally redid. For example, he took all the clapboards off, put an extra layer of sheathing, and then re-clapboarded it. But that meant he had to replace all the windows because they weren't thick enough. And so he did a lot of work then. So the house really is more to this, and the barn was built then, to the style of 1850, 1840, somewhere in there. Oops. But we managed to rebuild the hearth, the original hearth, which was buried under brick. The beehive oven had been hidden over the years and turned into a furnace flue from the basement. It was, not all that well treated, but the original was beautiful. And we brought in a fellow who was here in Maine, who's probably the best historic mason in the country. And he came and did remarkable work to get the fireplace working again and back in business. And here's, we replaced the hearth. They had watched too many John Wayne movies and found an old log and some boards in the 50s or 60s and made a hearth. And immediately most of the historians and historic architecture people looked at it and said, that's not a hearth from the 1700s. So we had some really great guys from Pownellborough Restorations come and build a surround that would have been appropriate for the time period. We don't know what the original looked like. And then we sealed it all up. Well, it had been sealed up in concrete, but we resealed it and used it. We started cooking in both the fireplace and the beehive. I've cooked lobster, prime rib, clams, everything you can think of in the beehive, which is a blast. And it's been really great because suddenly very popular is the idea of those domed pizza oven things you see at fairs and carnivals. Well, we've got one built into the Colburn house, which is really kind of fun. Upstairs is a canoe, for example. There's a boat museum there. The Arnold Group over the years had collected these boats people had donated. One of them is this canoe built by the Penobscot Indians around 1790 from the style and design and materials. That's not a 1790s Native American, but we had programs and so forth there. But it's a beautiful canoe. It came in 3 pieces to the Arnold Group, and a couple of boat builders were in the Arnold Expedition Historical Society back in the 70s. So they put it back together, and they used pine pitch and everything, and then they put it in the water, braver than I am, and paddled it around in the Kennebec, and then stuck it in the barn and never put it back again. But they were perfectionists. They wanted to see. But that was built, that was the kind of thing that when Arnold left the house, he left in one of those canoes that leaked so badly that at Fort Western he got in a dugout. So we found a dugout from some time period, and it's also in the barn. So you get a sense of all the different vessels. But these are just some pictures of where the house was and where it got to. There's the barn and, of course, the house at the top. There's a beautiful field of lupin for those 3 weeks a year in front of the house. Really picturesque. So we've come a long way. There's the barn. It had been rebuilt in the 70s, and then they just set it on the ground. No stones, no foundation, no nothing. So naturally, the whole floor wicked up 30 years of moisture and rotted. So we had to replace every post down from 3 feet up. So, but when it was finished, as you can see up on the top right, it's a beautiful center. We opened up the bay again. The boats are up top in the museum. But we've had lectures, demonstrations. The reenactors can go in there when it's raining and show people all their stuff. In the lower right-hand corner, you see the inside of the carriage house. We built some display cases and put artifacts that have been found over the years, or still being found, from the actual march. So we did just a ton of work. A little curiosity, I mentioned Gustavus Adolphus Colburn and Ruben's grandson. And if you notice this stop in Farmington, if you're driving up and down the river in Farmington, you see those funny bumps in the water. Gustavus Adolphus built those in 1860 to trap lumber as it came down, to seclude his lumber from the channel of the river. So he would bring lumber down the river and boom it up in that area and let it go by. It's the only place where the river's wide enough and a convenient little island in the middle to store lumber like that. So everyone else's lumber just goes right past the island. His goes in there and chains up. And I always used to see them, and I knew they were log boom, pilings. But we have the record of how many feet of logs, boards he had to use, how many tons of stone. It's really interesting how the records of him building this whole contraption. But it was Ruben's grandson carrying on Ruben's logging and lumbering tradition. There's another connection, too, at the Colburn house, which is neat, and that is Martha Ballard. She didn't, so far as we know, attend a birth at the Colburn house, but she knew and dined with and visited the Colburns a lot. She was friendly with them. In her diary, there's a few mentions of, I dined with the Colburns tonight. She went down and went back. So in the back there, it freaks people out when they visit, is a mannequin, a realistic museum doll, if you will, or museum person. And there's a little presentation in there of a birthing stool and a bed. Where, so we talk about Martha and midwifery and the fact that children were born there. Just many of you probably know, this is the fake Martha. I mean, well, this is Martha, but she's fake. And so she looks really real. She spent a couple of weeks in my office right behind me, and it would freak me out every time I got up. I mean, she has real-looking eyes. It's really kind of creepy. And the kids like it. You push a button, and she'll hear her read from her diary and stuff. But anyway, we did a display there for her as well. The other ballard in there, that map, you see, whoops, I'm trying to go backwards here. Well, I'm not used to using the Mac, so I'll leave it alone. Anyway, there we go, now I can. Once more, if right outside of Martha's room is a map, a watercolor, this is a lithograph of it, but, and the map is was made by Ephraim, her husband. And Ephraim was around when he was a cartographer and surveyor and so on. And he was around when Arnold's men passed through. He was living in one of the buildings at Fort Western, I think. Had been Fort Western. Had been Fort Western. And all of the men in Arnold's, apparently he talked a lot and loudly. Because a lot of the men in Arnold's expedition met him and wrote about him in their diaries and memoirs and mentioned him. And generally, the frame of thought, and this is a quote from one of the soldiers in Arnold's expedition, he was a rank Tory, but traded fairly and reserved the right to speak his own mind. So basically, he never shut up about what a dumb thing this whole revolution was, and he was but when they needed fish, he didn't charge them too much for it. So he was okay. We'll leave him around. So they caused no discomfort to Ephraim. Along the march, and I was trying to isolate some of this down near the bay for you a little bit, but the Arnold Expedition Historical Societies came into being in the late 60s to put on, in 1975, a full-scale reenactment of the march to Quebec. And darn if they didn't pull it off. They needed the help of the Army to truck them across the border, the National Guard and everything. But then, once that was over, they had battles on the Plains of Abraham in Quebec. It's really fascinating. They took over the use of the Colburn House that the state had bought pretty much for that purpose. And for a long time, those people in the organization would go up and search for artifacts and put canoes back together and so on. Well, that, of course, was in 1975, and as time went on, they passed on. And so the group is a little smaller now, but still has in the carriage house at the Colburn House the artifacts display. And one of them, this is Dude Wing, who passed away a couple of years ago. And Dude there's so many of these stories of finding artifacts. He was up on, this was up near Eustace, and he had been metal detected for a while and found a little thing here and a little thing there, but nothing of consequence. So finally he said, look, I'm tired, I'm going to give up for the day. And he forgot to turn his machine off, and when he tucked it under his arm and bent down to pick something up, it went whoop, whoop. So he turned around and looked, what the heck, and he dug 832 musket balls. He said, I didn't sleep much that night. What's funny about that is, I wish I'd been there, this is years ago, is if you take 832 musket balls, they're the size of a musket ball cache. And the weight is a third of a hundredweight. Barrels were made back then by how much they weighed, not how big. A barrel of flour was this big, barrel of musket balls was only this big, but they weighed the same. To carry and put in a boat and figure out the measurements of the weight of the boat and so on. What he didn't know was probably the nails and pieces of the barrel were still around. And so somebody on Arnold's march had finally, carrying it up for the 14th time over some rapid, said, I'm tired of this, threw it on the ground and kept going. And there it sat and grew over until Dude forgot to turn his metal detector off one day. And now those are sometimes on display at the Colburn House. At one point, we all went looking for a hospital site. The march went up to Kennebec and had a choice. It's going to be an easy choice, but I'll pose it to you anyway. You can either go straight up the Kennebec to the Forks, going up against some of the best whitewater rafting in all the eastern United States, or not. The trouble with not, which is obviously the choice, is you leave the Kennebec on the western side, you climb 1,500 feet in elevation in less than a mile. And then you go across what's known as the Great Carrying Place. Native Americans for thousands of years would pass to avoid the forks and the rapid whitewater rapids of the Kennebec, and would cut over to the Dead River, the west branch of the Kennebec, because there are these 3 ponds. And so you could walk for a while, but then you could paddle. And then you could walk, and then you could paddle. So you saved a lot of walking and hiking. Now, natives in those days had their canoes in the bushes around every water body and pond and so on. So they would just go to the first pond, rustle around, find the canoe, put it in, paddle over, and then walk to the next one and so on. On the way back, the canoes were all where they belonged. So it was an easy trip for them, but 3 guys in a birch bark canoe, which isn't very heavy, is pretty easy to do. An army of 1,000 men, not so much. So Arnold had sent out the army in 3 groups. The first group was to cut a path, blaze and cut a small path through the woods. There was a path the natives had worn, but again, 2 or 3 guys in a canoe don't make, a 4-lane highway. The next group was supposed to widen that path and kind of establish campsites. And then the third group had most of the provisions, and it was their job to just go because everyone else had cleared the path. Well, along the way, as they came out of the Kennebec, people started to get sick and so on. So they left behind a number of people. They built a log hut and left behind the sick in this hut and said, look, when you get better, either go back or come follow us, but, we got to leave. Well, it took us a while, and in 1974, members of the Arnold group found the hospital site, and with metal detectors found a number of things. And one time they took Florence, her husband, took her along. We always kid about what the conversation must have been like. You're going up in the woods, I'm going up there with you. So he took her along, and she spent the day with them, and they found some bullets and a little of this and that, but found the hospital site. And then came back, and that night in bed, she said to her husband, or the next morning, I had a dream last night. Remember that big elm or hemlock tree or whatever it was? At the base of that, there's ceramics. And he was like, what the? She goes, we have to go back. No, I'm not taking you back in the woods because you had a dream. Well, I'm sure 8 or 9 more conversations, he finally said, get in the car, we'll drive back up there. They dug under the tree, and sure enough, found a little piece of pottery and another little piece of pottery and another, until they had almost the entire makings of a rum jug. So somebody she glued it all back together with airplane glue and sent it to the Smithsonian. They said, yeah, this was made by these 2 brothers in Newburyport, Massachusetts, somewhere between 1770 and 1780. They had a rum jug. They were a potter that made rum jugs. Came from Newburyport, Massachusetts, where Arnold left, and ended up in the woods. So somebody finished off the rum at the hospital for medicinal purposes, of course, and then smashed it because it was empty, and the tree grew over it until Florence had her dream. That's how it happened. So a number of 40 years, 30-some-odd years go by, and we went back up a couple of winters ago to try and find the hospital site again, better metal detectors, and Dude and his son Kenny, who were the only 2 forest rangers in Eustace for the last 40 years, because Dude did it till he retired, and then Kenny took over, and he did it till he retired. We go into the woods, and they had been there the day of the first one. And we marched up the trail. We started this way, and Dude's marching with the metal detector because he hasn't been there in years, and he loves this stuff. And Kenny goes, wait a minute, I remember this, and like 30-something years later. And he goes, over this way. Well, 2 seconds later, you hear, whoop, because Dude had gotten his metal detector out and started to find things. And so the whole crowd, there were about 8 of us. In the course of the day, we found most of the pieces of a kettle that had been smashed. We found a spoon, a jackknife, just an abundance of these great artifacts of Arnold's 1,000 or so men being camped in this space. Found this great axe, stamped Morrison, probably a guy in Londonderry, New Hampshire. Piece of a musket, lots of musket balls, lots of nails. None of them bent, which is odd to us, because usually you have 2 boards, you drive a nail through them, and then you bend it so as to hold the boards together. But they weren't, and sometimes we'd have 8 or 10. So they must have been, guys had a bag or an extra collection of nails to repair Bateaux and then drop the bag. And the reason the hospital site's important is we know they all camped in a certain area. When you sit up and sit down and sleep, stuff falls out of your pockets, or you drop something and forget to pick it up. So it's a very rich area for finding some of these things. One of my favorite stories about the march is a place called Chateauguay Falls near Eustace. And the falls, as you can see, aren't tremendous, but the boats had to be carried. And a quick thing about that process. When they were a little bit worse than this, you would pull the boat over to the edge of the shore. The men who were walking would come out of the woods, and you'd grab a barrel of musket balls, and you'd hike to the top of whatever the obstruction, which could be the falls in Skowhegan, and most of you have seen those. Drop the stinking barrel of musket balls, go back for a barrel of biscuit, barrel of flour. Carry that up, drop it, go back and forth. And then finally go back, and with the setting poles that Ruben had made, 2 guys in one pole and 2 guys in another would set the canoe on the bateau on top and carry it upside down above on these 2 poles, 4 guys or more, and they'd carry it up the blessed falls or obstruction or whatever. Flip the thing back over into the water, take the barrels, put it in, and then the other barrels and put it in, go back and get your personal gear and start walking again. And then 4 different guys would get in the bateau and push it along. And in places like this, the stops were Madison and Solon. There's obstructions in the river all the time, so they were always carrying these god-awful barrels of everything, which is how dudes probably got thrown on the ground and gave up on. But at Chateauguay Falls, there was a of all the other things that hit the expedition, there was a hurricane. They described it. It was basically a cold front. But the river jumped about 10 feet in height over the course of an overnight. They fell asleep around the campfire, woke up when it went out in the morning, in the middle of the night, because the water had come up so far. Many of their bateaux were scattered because they didn't tie them up. Who knew the river was going to jump up 10 feet in this horrible rain? But then after that, they went up to Chateauguay Falls, and it was a huge freshet coming this way. There are many descriptions of the men going from one shore to the other, trying to make their way, flipping over, almost drowning. But almost everybody mentioned this one particular thing, which was the payroll for the march. And it was in a chest, and it was all coins. By this point in time, many of the men were starting to worry whether they were going to make it alive to the villages in Canada because they were running out of food. And they kind of calculated the number of days it would take to get there, how many pounds of food, and they didn't match up. So you started to get worried about, are we going to starve to death? And then when we get to Canada, just because we reach the villages doesn't mean these people in the fall are going to give up the food they've just harvested. So we need to pay them. So the money was really important, not for the payroll at this point, but just to buy food. So everyone noticed the canoe flipped and the trunk or chest sunk to the bottom. And since people largely almost drowned, they said, well, we can't get it back. And so all of them sort of forlornly looked at what was going to buy them food and keep them alive. Fast forward a number of years later, people are still going to Chateauguay Falls to look for the Arnold treasure. And it's one of those fun stories about doing history. There were 2 guides along, 2 Getchell brothers from Vassalboro had gone up a couple of weeks ahead and mapped the route, looked around and so on. And 2 different brothers, or one different brother and one of the same, had gone up with the expedition to mark trails, point out, turn here, turn there, whatever. And I was visiting with their great-great-great, whatever it is, grandson, who had a store at Getchell's Corners in Vassalboro. And so he's telling the story, he goes, well, when you're doing your research, and he's passed away now, but he's an old fella, he said, look something, try to be alert for something. I said, what's that? And he goes, it's nothing to do with the march and everything, but I'm on the land my great-great-great-great-grandfathers who went on the march as guides bought when they were younger. And for the life of us, nobody in our family can figure out how these 2 poor yeoman farmers who escaped busy Augusta in 1770-something and lived in Vassalboro, which was just, forest, suddenly could buy all of this land. And I went, wait a minute. So I went back to the Quebec Registry of Deeds, which go back that far, and there's a very unusual thing in the deed. Many of you had a deed, bought and sold a house, and it usually says for $1 in consideration thereof. If you paid $1 million for the house or $50 for the house, it never says what it is. You can find those in mortgage records. But this one didn't. This one was very specific about exactly the amount of money paid and in what form. And it said, in consideration of the sum of $4,000 of the present circulating currency of North America, Spanish coins, because nobody did anything British. You didn't drink British tea, you named towns after the French, nothing was British back then. And the further sum of 105 pounds, 5 shillings. That's a pretty detailed version of $1 in consideration thereof. So I'm like, what in the world? And then it said, in gold and silver coin, paid in hand to me by John and Nehemiah Getchell, both of said Vassalboro. Where in the world do you think John and Nehemiah Getchell would have found coinage of that type and amount in Vassalboro, Maine in 1776? Well, they waited a year before they spent it, but no telling. As soon as the water went down, John and Nehemiah Getchell were back up at Chateauguay Falls diving until one of them came up with the trunk in his hands. But to this day, there are still people who come through looking at those falls for those coins, And oftentimes they'll ask, what happened to those coins? And I said, I know where they are. Really? Yeah, they're in Vassalboro. It's a giant piece of land. Get some corners, you can't miss it. There's still some who can't stand that. They still believe they're not there. But anyway. So there's the Arnold Memorial Tablet at the house, which was dedicated in 1913. Had a fairly good crowd. Notice the Colburn House is white with black shutters back in those days. It went through various periods of upgrading over the years. And the tablet is still in front of the house. So that's, I'll tell you about the rest of the story, but that's quickly the sort of area of Merrymeeting Bay, Kennebec River, where this happened. A couple of quick stories about Ruben and how time doesn't change. Ruben's family, like many, many others, and it's where Maine came from in many ways, came early, not long after the Pilgrims, moved westward in Massachusetts to get away from town politics, basically. And they went almost as far, well, to Lowell, although it was not Lowell at the time, and then got so sick of it there, they said, heck with it, we're going up to Maine. We got to get away from all of this stuff. So they bought cheap land in Maine. They were running out of land in Massachusetts, and they could buy it cheap in Maine. So they moved up here and built the house in 1765. And I've always had people always talk about the Pilgrims and those who moved westward left, for religious persecution and so on. Well, it wasn't quite like that. In those days, the congregation and the town were one and the same. You couldn't get a charter as a town without a permanent ministering congregation. And the town, the church and the town hall were the same building. And Ruben was going 30 miles every day, every Sunday, each way, down the Kennebec to Georgetown to go to church. And he'd come back Monday morning. He said, well, the heck with this every Sunday. I'll just build a dang church right next to my house, and I'll give it to the town, and we'll find a minister, and I'll have to walk through my backyard. So the house, the church next to the Colburn house, is built on the same basic foundation as this original townhouse, City Hall townhouse that he built and gave to he framed it, did everything but the shingles. He shingled the roof and just said, here, it's yours. You can have it for free. The town took a vote, and at the time Pittston was collected of two different parts of town, East Pittston and the part near where the Colburns were. There were more people living in East Pittston, and said, by God, we're not going to let them establish the town over there, because then we'll have to go all the way across town to go to church. Well, you're going 30 miles to Georgetown now. But they said, nope. They wanted the town to sort of begin and happen over in East Pittston, not along the river. So they rejected Ruben's gift of a townhouse. Anyway, long story short, a couple of years later, they finally said, okay, we'll take it, but then hemmed and hawed over who was going to, sheathe and clabbered it. And eventually the town, East Pittston, built its own congregation and so on and so forth. But what it makes clear to you is that religion and politics back then were kind of the same. When the minister gave a bad sermon, the town selectmen's meeting the next week was going to be interesting. And it isn't a day that goes by today in Maine you don't pick up the newspaper and see town selectmen get in a fight, or the mayor, accuses the selectmen of this, or suddenly the city manager got fired. We don't change much, us Mainers, but we come from a long tradition of people who wanted to get away from that. And no matter how far they went, they couldn't get away from people, and we all, are still like that. But anyway, that's what's interesting about the Colburn house is that. Then he built the house across the street in 1799 for his son and his wife, the one next door to that for his daughter and her husband, and his another one down the street where his brother lived, the cemetery. So this little road, they straightened the route from Augusta to Wiscasset many years ago, widened it, and cut off a piece of what's now Arnold Road, cut a curve off. And so this little hook of a road, or bow, if you will, is what was Colburn Town. And there's the cemetery, the one-room schoolhouse, the Colburn School, the church. It's a replacement of the town hall, but the church on the site that he built. And it's a really interesting little area. And we are in the process of finalizing a contract with the Old Fort Western in Augusta to manage and take care of it. And because the fort is about the same time period, and they have costume people and are in that business, and we're just not at the Bureau. So it should be open more. But let me continue. So we go to Quebec. We pass over the height of land at Arnold Pond, again, strangely, ironically named. And the men, many of them start to starve, to freeze to death. Men on the expedition starved, froze, ate too much after starving, because when you're starving and you eat too much too quickly, it'll kill you. Drowned, had trees fall on them, everything but a bear attack. Literally everything that can kill you in the woods, somebody on Arnold's March died of it. Of the 1,100 or so people who left Newburyport, 400 of them made it to Quebec, alive. The rest either died along the way, turned back, disappeared, never to be heard from again. Got to Quebec, couldn't get the help they needed, didn't get the thousands of Quebecois to join them. Finally, a very, very cold night, crossed the river, and it's a mile across, the St. Lawrence is there. Got to the other side, 3/4 of them had gotten across, and something happened that the other quarter couldn't go then, something. So they're standing on the Plains of Abraham, freezing cold, and there's no army yet, it's no militia, it's still militia, so everything has to be by vote. So Arnold says, okay, let's go take the city. Like, no, 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 we have to vote. So the officers get together and by one vote say, nah, we'll wait till tomorrow. Because they're waiting, because they're cold, but they're waiting for the other men to come across. What they found out later, to their chagrin, was that the St. John Gate, the nearest gate to them into the city, was open and unguarded. All they had to do was march into the city and form up in a military fashion and say, huzzah, and the city would have been theirs without firing a shot. There were no British soldiers inside. During the night, a British officer who'd been dispatched from Montreal got into the city, closed and locked the doors, manned the cannons, and so on. And the next day, when the other part of Arnold's men came across, they went to attack the city and never made it in. So, but for a one guy's vote, who knows whether Canada would be part of the United States today or what. But in any event, they then laid siege to it until finally the night before New Year's Eve, the December 30th, a blizzard, a storm came, and they said, okay, we'll attack the city. And the plan then was the troops had come with General Montgomery from Montreal, and the plan was to attack the city from two different directions in the lower town, because it was easier to penetrate, and then there's a big ramped street right up into the upper town. The bigger thing about the lower town, too, is where all the rich people's warehouses were. And they were mostly Quebecois or British citizens. They didn't care who won the revolution. They just didn't want their warehouse full of beaver skins to burn. So they'd go with it, whatever side happened to be winning or in charge. So they went to attack the lower town to get the citizens to say to the British soldiers, get out, we're not going to lose all of our goods, we're surrendering. Amazingly, well, as Montgomery came around one side, this drunken British fellow fired a cannon before he ran away from the battery, killed Montgomery, and his men left and went back to camp. So there was not a two-pronged attack to keep the troops in the city, you know, in both directions. Despite that, Arnold, in the first couple of seconds, was shot. A bullet hit either his leg or a piece of rock hit his leg, but he managed, he was immediately taken from the battlefield and wounded in the leg. His men somehow, without much direction, marched on and came about this close. They took the first barricade and almost took the second before they couldn't, because the men who were supposed to fight Montgomery now could come over and reinforce. So they ended up spending the night in a warehouse and surrendering. And those men spent the next 4 or 5 months in a dungeon, basically, suffering from smallpox and other things in Quebec. Arnold got away because he'd been carried away with his wound, and Montgomery was dead. So they failed to take the city, but because of that, we probably won the revolution. And here's why. By attacking the city, they caused the British government to send the next army available to Quebec instead of to Virginia. If they had sent them to Virginia, they'd have wiped Washington out, the war would have been over. Instead, they sent it to relieve Quebec, which had been threatened by this army of some amount, the rumors were different. So that army comes over to Quebec, and then Arnold retreats slowly in front of them as they make their way to Montreal, and then down the Lake Champlain route, if you will. And then, as fall is getting closer, Arnold and his men knew the British were coming, and they had these constructed ships they had taken apart and brought over and could rebuild on Lake Champlain. Arnold and his men went into the woods. Many of these guys from Maine who built ships for a living, or built boats. Ruben, by the way, had built many ships on his property there for a long period of time. Went into the woods and built a little navy of about 7 ships and found a few cannon to put on them and hid behind an island in Lake Champlain, and when the British sailed by, they fired a few cannon shots. So the British turned around, and it's harder to come upwind and upriver. And so they fought them long enough to a stalemate. And that night in the dark, they slipped past them and then fired at them again. So they basically harassed and harangued the British to slowly make their way down Lake Champlain. By the time they finally destroyed this little navy of 7 boats, the other first battle of the American Revolution, like the Margareta at East Machias, and the birthplace of the U.S. Navy, there's 4 of them, and the Navy doesn't take an opinion. Yep, they're all the birthplace of the U.S. Navy. This is one of them that's considered the birthplace of the U.S. Navy. Another one is the town where they built these boats and then sailed them back up to the island. But anyway, But they harassed and harangued the British long enough and finally burned their own ships to keep the British from taking them and moved into the wilderness. The British at that point, the general in charge said, you know, it's too late in the year, it's cold, let's go back to Montreal for the winter. Fortunately, because if he had not, he would easily have taken Ticonderoga, gone down the Hudson River, and broken the colonies in half. The Jeffersons and the Washingtons cut off from the Adams and the Hancocks, and it would have been a devastating blow, which was the point, to try and split the colonies in half. One of the reasons Arnold and Washington had launched the expedition was to prevent that from happening. So instead of wintering at Ticonderoga, at Fort Ticonderoga, and then simply destroying the colonies the next spring, they went back to Montreal. Well, all of these colonists in upstate New York who had stayed out of the war up until then suddenly realized the British are coming to my backyard next spring. So, okay, now I'm going. Give me a musket, I'm going to fight. And by the time spring came, thousands of patriotic colonists had flooded into the region, Ticonderoga. And when the British came back, there was this massive army, untrained but massive. They met at the Battle of Saratoga. In the course of the battle, it's a long story, but a general had been put in charge that didn't like Arnold for lots of reasons. And he had sent a messenger to arrest Arnold and tell him to get off the battlefield. Meanwhile, Arnold is riding from unit to unit, creating charges and fighting the British and basically running the battle, while the officer, the general in charge, was back in his tent 3 miles away having tea and sending people, go get that Arnold off the battlefield. What does he think he's doing? So he really had no command, but he's leading, he's constructing this battle. And I always have this image of some poor proper British officer, or former British officer, on a horse with a piece of paper riding, trying to catch Arnold. Because as soon as, when he hands him the piece of paper, he's got the order, he's got to stop. But if he stays away from him, he can keep fighting. So eventually Arnold pulls together, there was this German redoubt, an artillery position that was key to the battlefield. And Arnold grabbed one of his men, one of the sharpshooters who'd been along, riflemen who'd been along with him on the march, and said, "See that guy with the funny hat? Yeah, can you shoot him?" "Yeah, I bet I could." So the guy took out the musket, shot, and killed the officer in charge of this battery, causing it to be cast a bit into confusion. Arnold then gathered the men around him, many of whom had been on the march with him and built this navy in the woods and so on, and charged the redoubt. As they go over the top of the redoubt, winning the Battle of Saratoga, Arnold's horse was shot and went down on the same leg that had been wounded at Quebec. Now, there are two versions of the story you can pick. History is multiple choice usually. One is that Arnold said, "But that I had more than one leg to give for my country," or some such thing like that. The other story, which always suits me and is probably true, is Henry Dearborn, the first officer to him, bent over him and said, look at Jilly, he goes, "Would you believe it? The same damn leg." I kind of side toward, in my Civil War studies, a lot of veterans tell me, there's all the stories, tell my mother I died for my country, tell my mother I love her. A lot of combat veterans used to say to me, well, mother was in the conversation, but not in that context at all. So there's always the real, it's probably more, a horse lands on the leg that still hadn't recovered from a bullet wound, and you say, oh, the same damn leg. Anyway, Arnold was disabled for the rest of his life, so Washington chose to put him in charge of West Point. Just be in charge of the fort. You don't have to, be all that fit. And it was the beginning of the spiral that led to his trading, his treason, thank you. I'll get to it eventually. So anyway, it's a bit of the Arnold story, but Henry Dearborn, who stood over him when he said the same damn leg, and this has been a puzzlement to me, settled in Gardner, Maine. Now, along this trip, they starved, and they died, and they got hit by lightning, and trees fell on them. And after the war, Dearborn said, I think I'll go retire to, that lovely place we went when we all starved. And what? Yeah. So he went to Gardner, and there he lived most of his life, but he became Thomas Jefferson's only, back in those days it was called Secretary of War, not Secretary of Defense, fought the War of 1812, some say not very well. Was at Fort Edgecombe because that was, built Fort Edgecombe and supervised it because it was close to home. And so the sort of tentacles of the march continued, for a long time afterwards. I forgot to put it up here, but we have, I'll get to the Henry Dearborn story in a sec. So the conclusion is that because they threatened the city of Quebec, the British had to act by sending an army. If they had taken the city, the British would have said, we've lost Quebec, send the army and crush Washington. But by attacking but not taking it, the British sent Burgoyne and his army to Quebec. And later, in one of the greatest military victories of all time, the British army, at Saratoga, was captured whole by the Americans, surrendered the army because Arnold had helped defeat them at Saratoga. And people to this day still talk about Saratoga as the Gettysburg of the Revolution. The French saw that the Americans could win not only a decisive battle, but capture an entire British army. Hell, we haven't done that since all of the wars between France and England all these years. So the French said, okay, we're going to recognize them, we're going to send support, we're going to send our navy, So the turning point of the war that really set the Americans on a path to win was Saratoga, which happened because Arnold had almost, but not, taken Quebec. So we have Arnold to thank for not taking Quebec, because if that one guy had voted, the British would have crushed Washington with a second army, to face him. He already had one army facing him. The revolution would have ended somewhere in Virginia, and we'd all, who knows what the history would be after that. So it's fascinating, but it was not just Arnold at Quebec. It was the Valcour Island and the navy he built and the fighting at Saratoga. So the end of the campaign was eventually the end of the Battle of Saratoga that started in Ruben Colburn's front yard on the Kennebec River, not far from, well, they sailed through Merrymeeting Bay. The only interesting thing about the bay we know of is Henry Dearborn's ship ran aground, and he went on shore for the night at the island off of Richmond, but there is and this is all speculation, there is a rock, and you folks may know about it, on the southeast side of Dram Rock. And the theory is, without any basis, but it makes sense, the soldiers had to spend the night on the ship. They'd been through a storm and other things. And so Dearborn, the completely assumed construction is, ordered everyone to get a dram of rum just to keep them complacent for another night till the tide came back in, the boat could float, and they sail it to Colburn's. Whether or not that's true, nobody knows for sure. It's not written anywhere. But why else would you call it Dram Rock? And that's how rocks like that tended to get named. It couldn't be Henry ran aground here rock, because that's not very ceremonial. But anyway, so the march that started in little Ruben Colburn's yard with his boats. By the way, I didn't mention the Bateaux. He had 2 weeks to saw the lumber. So it was all very green, heavy, wet lumber. These boats weighed 400 pounds, and they were only supposed to weigh half that. And not enough nails, and green lumber doesn't, usually you build those boats and let them dry and tighten up. Well, they were green lumber, because he had to start cutting the trees 2 weeks earlier. So there were a number of things that led to no one ever blamed Ruben for building lousy boats. He had green lumber and no nails. So it was a very difficult thing, but he did it. He had 220 of them ready in 2 weeks. And others have speculated, why didn't they just use canoes? Well, how many Native Americans and how many, elm roots and all those other things can you buy to produce those canoes? And I'll answer any questions you have, and stick around. I've got copies of the book if anyone's really interested. But I have to say a couple of things. One, as I mentioned before, no one had written a book on this until 1903. And I have tended to write these relatively small 120, 130 page books to reintroduce people to a story. And like this one is a story I grew up with. Since I wrote this, 5 more books about Arnold's expedition and the March to Quebec have been written. So it was great to kind of, hey, somebody wrote about Arnold, and he's a traitor, but people liked it, so okay, and all of these different, Benedict Arnold's Navy, and all these other books, which is great, and that was kind of the point, was to throw out the bones of the story and say to everybody else, and people have written this thick, which is good, and somebody else can go write that one, I'll just get it back in people's consciousness. But there's so much to tell of the story, and it's hard, so I tried to kind of stay down toward the bay a little bit. But I'd be happy to answer any questions. If you're shy, I'll stick around after. You can come up and individually. Well, thanks again, folks. I appreciate the time.